Hello there folks, this is Robin Nichols here, having a bit of a chit chat all about the information palette or the info palette in Adobe Photoshop Elements. Now I just double clicked on a RAW file and it's open in the Adobe Photoshop Elements Camera Raw 8.0 window here, and I've just enlarged it a bit too much, and you can see, that's a reasonably looking shot, and I can of course tweak the exposure, maybe bump up the contrast a little bit, maybe push up the highlights and bring up the exposure, whoops, not too much. I think, well, that's not too bad. If you'll notice up at the top of the screen here we have of course the histogram. The histogram is very handy for showing me the display or the distribution of the tones in the image. But what we don't always look at is this RGB thingy just here. And this RGB thingy, if I move into the image, and again it doesn't matter pretty much what tool I've got here, it reads out an RGB value. Now the red, green, blue value is very, very important. All cameras are RGB. All monitors are RGB. But most printers, when it comes to printing, are CMYK, and you think, uh-oh, what's that going on? What's that all about? Well, RGB, red, green, and blue. It's known as a subtractive color method. So, for example, we mix red, green, and blue in order to make a palette of colors on the screen. But if we mix equal amounts of red, green, and blue, we get white. So how do we make black when we're printing? Well, we normally use a color space called CMYK. And CMYK is cyan, magenta, yellow, and, well, if you mix cyan, magenta, and yellow together, you get mud. So not very good if you've got a lot of black things like this black and white sign here. So we have to add a fourth color, which is K, which stands for black. Don't quite know how to work that one out, but that's what it stands for. So two different color spaces, the additive and the subtractive color method. So when we're looking at these pictures, it's kind of good to use this little pipette or any kind of tool, and we're just checking out the RGB to see the color values or the brightness values in the picture. Now, when I'm looking at, for example, the white area, vulture area that matches the sign, I'm thinking, is that actually white? Is it going to print on paper, or is there actually going to be some tonality in it? So we have a scale of 0 to 255. They're the range of tones in a picture, and we use this to judge whether we've actually over-edited it or under-edited. So here's the thing. If I'm over what I think is white in the picture, you can see it ranges at about 228, 220. So the maximum is actually 255. Let's just try it conversely in the black. So you'd think, well, black should actually be 0. If it's actually jet black and there is no visible detail in there, it should be about 0. But it's not. It's around 30, 28, 26, around that mark. So there is actually a fair bit of detail in there. Let's zoom in a little bit. And you can actually see, I don't know if you can see on the screen here, but you can actually see there is in fact, some detail to be seen. There's a smudge and there's some dirt on it as well, and that's probably giving me a much higher reading, than the absolute black. So what this is saying to me is that I can probably edit this darker if I want more impact and still have a tiny teensy-weensy little bit of detail, simply by using the black slider here. Now I can go blacker and blacker and blacker. Now I can look here, now you see my values have gone way down. So as a rule, it's a good idea to keep within 10 and 2, instead of 255, keep it about 240, 245, around that. So just pull away from the extremes in order to retain some of the detail in your image. Let's move on to, I'm just going to say done on that one. And in fact, now what I'll do is I'll go and open that again. I'll go and open that recently edited file. That's this raw file here. And I think what I'll do is I'll just open it for us, and we'll just open the image and we'll just have a look at the second information palette, which of course has a lot more information in it. And here it is. If you don't know where to find it, all the palettes are stashed underneath the window drop-down menu here. And there you can see info. Okay, so the info palette here has a confusing array of information, but let me explain. If I click on the little drop-down menu, you can have a grayscale information, kind of not really relevant really because this is not a grayscale image, but we have RGB, web color, and hue, saturation, and brightness color. So what we're really concerned with for most photographers is RGB color. But you may have a blog as well, so you may want to think, well, let's just have a look on web color. And the reason we have two different palettes for these two little fellas is very simple. We have a wider area of color, literally put more colors in the RGB color space than you do on the web color space. And that's why all people work on the web, you have a limited palette of colors. So I always draw the likeness between having something like 25 crayons in an RGB color palette. Okay, and they're the colors that you need to choose from. So if we move over here again, you can see, and again this works with any Elements tool, it doesn't matter what tool you're using, that's kind of nice thing about it, it gives you a readout. And so you can hunt through the image just to make sure that what you're seeing on the screen is actually going to retain some detail in highlights or in the shadows, and of course in the midpoints. All this stuff down at the bottom here, centimeters and dimension, show me, for example, things like the position of the cursor, and also things like the position of selections. Okay, and it gives you the dimensions and all this kind of thing. I personally would never ever use those. I'm not really interested in that at all. But what I'm interested is just very briefly just checking the RGB values in the image, just to make sure that what I'm looking at on the screen isn't actually a little bit too bright or a little bit less bright than I think it is. And this goes into that whole discussion about color spaces and trying to squeeze the massive amount of color and tonal detail that we capture with a camera into the very limited space that we have, for example, on the web, and the very limited space we have once we move to a regular consumer color printer. So that's a little bit of information about the info palette. I think it's very, very handy. It needs to be correlated with what you're going to do with the picture. So let's say you're going to print on an inkjet at home. So you need to have a look at the details here, making sure that you have, of course, a calibrated monitor to start with, and think, well, okay, I just want to retain some of the details in Mr. Vulture here, and edit it so that you've got a little bit of detail in the black, retain some detail in the whitest parts here, and think, gee, okay, that's pretty cool as well. It's below 230, which is pretty cool, and then print it, and just see if your print correlates with what you see on the screen. Now, if your printer is calibrated, and that's another different cup of tea, you'll find that you'll get within, I think, about 98% accuracy of what you see on the screen with what you get on the printer. But use the info palette just to correlate that, just to make sure what you're seeing is what you're going to get, because the information is more important and is certainly more accurate than our own eyeballs. We look at stuff, and as I say, this is a souvenir from a wonderful trip I did last year to Africa, and of course I've got nothing but warm fuzzy feelings about this trip, so everything looks fantastic, and I'm thinking, well, actually I need to take those rose tinted glasses off and look at them with a cold hard stare, just to make sure that I retain the right bits of information, and that's where the info palette comes in.